Welcome to the Human Archive. If you enjoy original science fiction stories about humanity finding its place among the stars, subscribe and join us for the next one. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Invitation. Observer Theryn Korrad had been on Earth for 23 days when a human neighbor asked if he was busy Saturday. Theryn immediately became suspicious. His cover identity was Keith Fenwick, a data analyst recently transferred to the North American division of a civilian aerospace supplier. The employment record was genuine enough to survive government review. His house had been purchased through 3 layers of financial intermediaries. His human appearance was maintained by a dermal projection system concealed beneath synthetic tissue, and his accent had been trained for 14 months before insertion. He had practiced casual conversation. He understood traffic customs. He could discuss professional sports convincingly enough to survive a barber shop. He had memorized several hundred common jokes and knew when not to use any of them. His mission was straightforward: observe humanity, map the informal social networks around the aerospace corridor, and identify which cultural behaviors affected cooperation, loyalty, and crisis response. He was not to interfere, and he was especially not to form unnecessary attachments. That last instruction was there because Theryn had built a career on obeying it. He was 39 Velathi cycles old, and had already completed 2 long observation assignments, without leaving behind a single relationship that required explanation. His supervisors called that clean tradecraft. Theryn called it professionalism. Velathi intelligence officers were trained to separate identity into layers. The observer collected information. The cover identity created access. The private self remained protected behind both. On his previous assignment, Theryn had spent 9 months pretending to be a freight auditor in a trade consortium, attended the retirement ceremony of a supervisor who believed they were friends, and boarded the extraction shuttle 4 hours later without saying goodbye. His evaluation had praised his emotional discipline. This did not mean the Velathi were cold. Theryn's mother still hosted extended family meals large enough to occupy 3 rooms of her home, and his younger brother could turn a ceremonial dinner into an argument about orbital policy before the first course arrived. The difference was that Velathi relationships came with recognizable boundaries. Kin was kin, colleagues were colleagues. Guests were invited for a reason, arrived at a stated time, and understood who owed the next invitation. Human neighborhood behavior resisted that kind of mapping. A stranger could help carry a bookcase and refuse compensation. A person who had been invited to eat could arrive hours before the food and somehow become useful without being assigned a role. People insulted close friends, fed people they disliked, and sent leftovers to residents who had never attended the gathering at all. Theryn had been selected for Earth partly because analysts considered him unusually good at sorting social noise from operationally meaningful behavior. 23 days after insertion, Calvin Prout was already making that reputation inconvenient. Then Calvin Prout appeared beside Theryn's moving truck, carrying the opposite end of a bookcase Theryn had not asked him to lift. Calvin was a broad human in his late 40s with graying hair, work boots, and a faded municipal electrical service shirt. "You got this end?" Calvin asked. Theryn adjusted his grip. "I did." "Yeah, looked like it." Calvin kept carrying anyway. Theryn had spent the first 3 weeks on Earth cataloging human contradictions. This was a new contradiction. The bookcase entered the house, and Calvin refused payment for helping move it. He also refused the packaged beverage Theryn offered him according to neighborhood hospitality protocols. Then he looked around at the half-unpacked living room. "You busy Saturday?" Theryn evaluated the possible motives. Calvin might be recruiting him into a neighborhood association, requesting repayment for the moving help, conducting some kind of informal political canvassing, or testing his willingness to provide access. None of the possibilities justified casual acceptance, so Theryn answered cautiously, "I do not believe so." "Good, come eat." Theryn waited. Calvin was already walking toward the door. "Where?" "My place." "What is the occasion?" Calvin stopped. "Saturday." Theryn searched his cultural memory for a regional holiday. None applied. Calvin added, "We're doing barbecue." That clarified almost nothing. "What time should I arrive?" Calvin considered the question with surprising seriousness. "Whenever." Theryn waited for the actual time. None came. Eventually he asked, "When is the food served?" Around 5. That was useful. Theryn arrived at 4:55. He considered this appropriately punctual. There were already 16 people in Calvin's backyard. Several had apparently been there for hours. Music played from a portable speaker. Children ran between chairs. 2 adults stood beside a large black cooking apparatus while holding bottles. A gray-haired man was arguing loudly with Calvin about vinegar. A woman near the patio waved at Theryn. "You're Keith, right?" "Yes." Noreen, Calvin's wife. She handed him a drink. Theryn looked at the gathering. "I thought dinner began at 5. Noreen glanced toward the smoker. "Maybe." Theryn checked his watch. It was 4:57. "What determines that?" "The meat." He looked toward the cooking device. "What time did you begin preparing it?" "Calvin got up around 5 this morning." Theryn stared. Noreen smiled. "First barbecue." "Yes." "Thought so." She walked away. Theryn remained where he was. His species, the Velathi, possessed ceremonial meals, communal feasts, and a serious tradition of culinary craftsmanship. But if food required 12 hours to prepare, the event was planned around that fact with explicit schedules, designated roles, and an established ceremonial purpose. Humans appeared to have lit a fire before sunrise and then invited people to stand around waiting for it. Theryn approached Calvin. The human opened the smoker. A cloud of fragrant smoke rolled across the patio. Inside lay a large piece of meat. Theryn studied it. "You possess an oven." Calvin looked at him. Calvin agreed that he owned an oven and that it would cook the meat faster. Theryn persisted, pointing out that human civilization also possessed pressure cooking, controlled steam, induction heating, and precision thermal chambers. Calvin's expression grew wary. Calvin finally asked where the argument was going. Theryn told him he had deliberately selected one of the slowest available cooking methods. Calvin agreed without embarrassment, which left Theryn with the only question that mattered. "Why?" Calvin looked genuinely confused. "Because we're barbecuing." Theryn waited. Calvin closed the smoker. That was apparently the complete explanation. His first field report on the event contained the following sentence. Meal preparation exceeded nutritional requirements by approximately 7 hours. No participant regarded this as a technical failure. His handler requested clarification. The handler's request bothered him for the rest of the evening because clarification was normally Theryn's strongest skill. On his first assignment, he had once explained a 6-party labor alliance in a report short enough to fit on one screen. Here he had 16 humans, a smoker, several children, 3 kinds of sauce, and no model that explained why any of them had arrived before dinner. He replayed part of the gathering through his concealed recorder. Calvin had spent almost no uninterrupted time cooking. He had adjusted the smoker, carried chairs, helped a child recover a ball from a tree, argued with Hector, introduced Theryn to 4 people whose names were apparently important, and disappeared inside twice to fetch things Noreen had already anticipated he would need. None of those actions were efficient if the objective was food production. Together, they had somehow produced both food and a gathering anyway. Theryn filed the problem under unresolved cultural behavior. He expected it to stay there until the mission ended. This was the first of many predictions barbecue would make him regret. Chapter 2. Sauce. The gray-haired man was named Hector Madsen. Theryn initially classified him as socially hostile. Hector arrived at Calvin's second barbecue carrying a bowl of potato salad, 2 6-packs of beer, and strong opinions about sauce. "You put that sweet garbage on the ribs again?" Hector demanded. Calvin did not look up from the grill. "You still pretending vinegar counts as flavor?" "It counts as barbecue. It counts as salad dressing." Hector made a dismissive sound, and Theryn watched from the patio as the disagreement escalated. Regional cooking traditions were invoked, several states were insulted, and one entire geographic region was eventually declared incapable of understanding pork. Theryn began revising his social map. Calvin and Hector had been categorized as close associates. That classification now appeared questionable. Hector opened Calvin's refrigerator without permission, removed a beer, and continued insulting him. Calvin responded by handing him a screwdriver. "While you're being useless, tighten the hinge on the smoker." Hector took the tool. Hector complained that Calvin had bought cheap hardware. Calvin reminded him that he had recommended it, and Hector immediately denied that this sounded like something he would do. "It was literally you," Calvin said. Hector crouched beside the smoker and repaired the hinge. Their argument continued throughout. 20 minutes later, Hector was holding a flashlight while Calvin adjusted a warped bracket. Theryn waited until Noreen passed. "Are Calvin and Hector experiencing relationship conflict?" Noreen stopped. She looked toward the two men. Hector was telling Calvin that his sauce tasted like melted candy. Calvin told him his potato salad could be used as structural adhesive. Noreen began laughing. Theryn waited. She laughed harder. "I am asking seriously." "I know." This appeared to make the situation worse. Eventually, she caught her breath. Once Noreen stopped laughing, she assured Theryn that Calvin and Hector were fine. Theryn pointed out that they had spent 26 minutes insulting each other's food, which Noreen called restrained. He reminded her that Calvin had described Hector's sauce as an attack on pork, and that Hector had suggested confiscating Calvin's smoker. Noreen only nodded. "That sounds like Hector." Theryn looked toward them. "Why does Calvin continue inviting him?" Noreen's smile faded into genuine confusion. "Because he's Hector." Theryn recorded the answer. It proved useless. The argument ended only when the ribs were served. Hector ate 3. Theryn noticed. "So you approve of them?" Hector looked offended. "I didn't say that." "You consumed 3 portions. A man can disagree with something and still finish it." Theryn considered. Human relationships contained too many contradictory data points. Later, Hector packed leftovers into a container and carried them home. Theryn added a note to his intelligence file. Verbal antagonism among familiar humans does not reliably indicate reduced affiliation. In some cases, repeated disagreement may coexist with high trust. Further observation required. His handler replied. "You are describing friendship." Theryn stared at the message. He knew what friendship was. That did not explain barbecue. Chapter 3. Guest Expansion. The third gathering was scheduled for 12 people. Theryn counted 23 before sunset. This should have produced a logistical failure. It did not. The first unplanned participant arrived with Rosa Estrin, a paramedic who lived 2 streets away. Rosa introduced the newcomer as a coworker whose apartment air conditioning had failed. Nobody objected. Then the coworker mentioned her 2 children were waiting with her sister. Noreen said, "Bring them." The sister came too. A neighbor walking a dog stopped near the fence because Hector called out to him. 5 minutes later, the dog was under the table and the neighbor had a plate. Theryn watched the population increase with growing concern. He found Noreen near the kitchen. "You planned food for 12. She looked around. Noreen seemed uncertain that anyone had actually planned for 12 people. When Theryn told her Calvin had given him that number, she said that sounded like Calvin. Theryn pointed out that nearly twice as many people were now present. Noreen insisted they had plenty, which he objected she could not know without recalculating the portions. Noreen opened the refrigerator. Containers filled nearly every shelf. "We've got plenty." Theryn inspected the available volume and discovered that Noreen was correct. Almost everyone had brought something, and nearly everyone had brought too much of it. Hector had made enough potato salad for a small military unit. Rosa brought bread. Another neighbor brought corn. Someone arrived with a tray of desserts despite Noreen already having desserts. The amount of food was objectively inefficient. Theryn said so. Noreen handed him a stack of plates. "That's what leftovers are for." At the end of the evening, the excess did not remain centralized. Noreen filled containers. One went to Rosa because she had a long shift the following day. Another went to an elderly neighbor who had not attended. The family with the broken air conditioner took enough food for lunch. Hector carried away ribs he continued claiming were improperly sauced. Theryn stood near the kitchen counter watching the distribution. The gathering had produced more food than required. The excess had then become tomorrow's meals across several households. He considered writing this in his report. Instead, he wrote, "Overproduction appears deliberate and functions as distributed redundancy." His handler replied, "Keith, they made too much potato salad." Theryn disliked when the handler used his cover name sarcastically. He also disliked that the handler might be correct. Chapter 4. Participation. Theryn intended to remain an observer. At Barbecue 4, Calvin handed him a bag of ice. "Cooler S by the fence." Theryn accepted it automatically. Halfway across the yard, he realized what had happened. He was performing labor. The task was low value, but mission doctrine was clear about unnecessary participation. He put the ice in the cooler anyway. An hour later, Noreen asked him to unfold chairs. Then Hector called him over to hold a flashlight while he repaired a loose gate latch. Theryn stood beside him with the light. Hector tightened a screw. Higher. Theryn raised the beam. Not that high. He lowered it. You ever held a flashlight before? Yes. Could have fooled me. Theryn looked at him. Hector grinned. Theryn had learned enough human interaction to recognize provocation without hostility. He replied, "Perhaps the difficulty is your inability to indicate where you require illumination." Hector laughed. There you go. The gate was repaired. Later, Calvin asked Theryn to monitor the grill for 5 minutes while he went inside. Theryn asked exactly what he was supposed to monitor. Calvin told him to make sure nothing caught fire. Theryn observed that this appeared important, and Calvin agreed. That made the delegation even less rational. You are assigning fire control to someone with no training on this equipment. Calvin was already walking away. You'll figure it out. Theryn stared after him. The grill did not catch fire. When Calvin returned, Theryn briefed him on temperature changes. Calvin listened politely, then said, "You know you can just look at it, right?" Theryn did not answer. His next report included observer assigned beverage cooling, seating deployment, structural illumination, and temporary food thermal supervision without prior role negotiation. The handler responded almost immediately by asking whether Theryn had been compromised. Theryn typed that he had not, paused, and then added that the ice had been necessary. The reply took longer this time. His handler was increasingly concerned about him. Theryn closed the channel. Calvin shouted from the patio, "Keith, you want a burger?" Theryn shouted back that he did. He justified this as cover maintenance. By then, Theryn had also learned that participation changed what he could observe. Standing at the edge of the yard had shown him who talked to whom. Carrying ice showed him who noticed an empty cooler before anyone asked. Holding the flashlight for Hector showed him that insult and trust could occupy the same conversation. Watching the grill revealed that Calvin would hand a small responsibility to someone long before formally deciding that person belonged. That bothered Theryn because the distinction between observation and participation had always been one of his safest professional boundaries. On his previous assignments, he could point to the exact moment a cover interaction became unnecessary. Earth kept producing interactions that were unnecessary individually and useful collectively. There was no operational requirement for him to unfold chairs. There was also no single moment when refusing every small request would have left his cover unchanged. He began keeping a mental list of tasks he had performed in Calvin's yard. Ice, chairs, flashlight, grill, carrying dishes, moving a table. The list resembled nothing in his mission plan. It also resembled, increasingly, the list of things people asked from someone they expected to be there next time. Chapter 5. Time. Human barbecue time was fictional. This conclusion required 6 gatherings to establish. At 11 in the morning, Calvin might say the food would be ready by 4. At 4, he would say another hour. At 5:30, he would announce they were close. At 6:15, Noreen would put out additional snacks and nobody would behave as though dinner had been delayed. Theryn finally confronted Calvin beside the smoker. You said 1 hour. Calvin checked the meat thermometer. Calvin reminded him that the promised hour had been an hour ago and then announced that the meat still needed time. Theryn objected that he had made a prediction. Calvin called it a guess. You stated it as a duration, Theryn said, unable to understand why this distinction did not bother anyone else. Calvin looked amused. What do you want me to do, argue with the brisket? Theryn looked toward the smoker. Theryn pointed out that Calvin controlled the heat. Calvin replied that heat was only part of it. When Theryn asked what the other part was, Calvin looked at the smoker as though the answer were self-evident. Brisket. Theryn's facial projection nearly failed to conceal his irritation. Hector, sitting nearby, called out, Ask him why he opened the smoker 3 times if he's so worried about the temperature. Calvin pointed at him. Nobody asked you. You keep saying opening it lets the heat out, then you open it every 20 minutes. I have to check it. Hector turned toward Theryn. You see what I deal with. Theryn did. Was beginning to. What surprised him was that barbecue finally became technically interesting. Internal temperature mattered, but so did connective tissue breakdown, surface moisture, fat rendering, airflow, fuel behavior, and the fact that different cuts tolerated different cooking profiles. A fixed clock estimate was less useful than sensory and thermal judgment. Theryn understood that. He disliked understanding it. One afternoon, Calvin handed him a probe thermometer. Check the flat. Theryn inserted it. The reading was close to target. He withdrew it. The internal temperature is acceptable. Calvin took the probe. Not done. The target range has been reached. Feel that? Calvin pushed the probe through the meat. Theryn noticed the resistance. Then Calvin tried another location. The probe entered with almost none. That's what you're looking for. Theryn stared. Theryn realized Calvin was judging mechanical resistance as well as temperature. Calvin agreed that it was one of several cues. Theryn demanded to know why he had not simply said so earlier. I just did, Calvin replied. For the remainder of the afternoon, Theryn found himself monitoring temperature and probe resistance. His handler contacted him during the process. Theryn ignored the first notification, then the second. On the third, he stepped away. The handler's translated voice sounded annoyed. You missed 2 scheduled check-ins. I was occupied. With what? Theryn looked toward the smoker. Field observation. There was a pause. The handler clarified with audible disbelief that Theryn meant barbecue. Theryn confirmed it. When reminded that he had already observed 7 such events, he looked toward the smoker and replied, This one contains a brisket. Another pause. Is that operationally significant? Theryn looked back toward Calvin. The human was pressing the surface of the meat and frowning thoughtfully. Yes. He ended the connection before he had to explain why. Chapter 6. The Failed Ribs. At Barbecue 9, Calvin ruined the ribs, completely. He became distracted helping a neighbor replace a failed lawnmower belt and let the cooker run too hot. The ribs dried out. The exterior burned. Even Theryn, whose native species possessed different taste receptors, recognized the failure. Calvin cut one rib apart, inspected it, and tasted the damage for himself. Then said a word Theryn had learned not to use in formal reports. Hector looked delighted. Hector announced that he had waited years to witness this failure. Calvin told him to shut up. Hector offered to fetch the vinegar sauce in case it could save the ribs, but Calvin looked at the blackened meat and admitted, nothing could save these. Theryn surveyed the gathering. The primary food had failed badly enough that Theryn expected the event itself to collapse with it. Instead, Noreen brought out beans and bread. Rosa ordered pizzas. Someone found sausages in a freezer. Hector ate one burned rib anyway so he could describe its defects accurately. The children kept playing, the music continued, and nobody left. 4 hours later, Calvin and Hector were still arguing beside the empty smoker. Theryn approached. The meal failed. Calvin looked toward the pizza boxes. Calvin pointed toward the pizza boxes and said dinner was right there. Theryn reminded him that he had spent most of the day preparing ribs that were now nearly inedible. Calvin agreed with both facts. That was exactly Theryn's problem, yet the gathering continued. Calvin looked around the yard. Why wouldn't it? Theryn opened his mouth, then closed it. That question remained in his head for several days. The food clearly mattered. Humans argued about it, spent absurd amounts of time producing it, judged it, improved it, and occasionally failed at it. Yet the gathering itself did not depend on culinary success. That weakened several of Theryn's models. His next report was shorter. Primary meal failure did not significantly reduce duration or participation. His handler asked. Then what is the primary function? Theryn stared at the question for a long time. He finally wrote. Undetermined. That night, Theryn reviewed recordings from the failed meal. The most striking detail was not that people had improvised replacement food. It was how little discussion the improvisation required. Noreen produced beans because she knew what was available. Rosa ordered pizzas because she had the application open and knew how many children were present. Someone else found sausages because they remembered what Calvin kept in the freezer. Hector stayed because leaving after Calvin ruined the ribs would have been interpreted as cruelty, though Hector would have denied this under interrogation. Theryn began to suspect he had been studying the wrong unit of analysis. He had treated each barbecue as an event whose purpose should be visible in its schedule, food, or stated occasion. Humans seemed to treat the event itself as almost incidental. What mattered was repetition. The same people appeared often enough to learn who had tools, who worked nights, whose child hated onions, who could be trusted with a key, who would bring too much food, and who would complain while helping anyway. He did not put that theory in the report. It sounded too informal, and he still lacked evidence that the pattern mattered outside the yard. Instead, he left the primary function listed as undetermined. He would get that evidence 7 weeks later. Chapter 7. People Who Aren't Friends. The neighbor Calvin liked least was named Martin Creel. Theryn knew this because Calvin complained about him regularly. Martin parked too close to the curb. His leaf blower was, according to Calvin, an instrument of war. They had argued twice about a fence line and once about a drainage channel that neither man actually owned. Martin did not attend barbecues. Until the afternoon, his wife collapsed. Theryn was helping Calvin move a table when Martin came through the side gate without knocking. Martin's face looked wrong. He was pale and breathing too fast. Calvin put the table down. What happened? Janet S. at the hospital. They think it's cardiac. Rosa went with the ambulance, but I need to get there. My daughter's driving in and I can't find anyone to take the dog. Calvin did not hesitate. Leave him here. Martin looked toward the backyard. Martin glanced toward the crowded yard and protested that Calvin already had people over. Calvin told him the dog would be fine. When Martin warned that the animal hated other dogs, Calvin simply said they would keep him inside. Martin's shoulders dropped. Thanks. Go. Martin left. Calvin went inside, found the dog, gave it water, and rearranged half the house so the animal could remain separated from the dog already in the yard. Then he returned to the barbecue. Theryn watched him. You dislike Martin. Calvin looked over. Calvin admitted that he disliked Martin sometimes. Theryn reminded him that they had argued about the fence the previous day and that Calvin had described Martin's leaf blower as evidence civilization had failed. Calvin grinned and said he still stood by that assessment. Calvin grinned. Still stand by that. Then why are you caring for his animal? Noreen answered from behind them. You don't have to like somebody to help them. Theryn turned. She was carrying a plate covered in foil. For Martin. And his daughter. Hospitals are terrible for dinner. She placed it in the refrigerator. Theryn looked from her to Calvin. No reconciliation occurred. When Martin returned 2 days later, his wife stable, he thanked Calvin. A week afterward, they argued about drainage again. Theryn found that oddly reassuring. Human assistance did not always require affection. Sometimes proximity appeared sufficient. He adjusted his model again. It did not become simpler. Chapter 8. Expense irregularity. By month 7, Theryn had begun bringing things. Initially, he classified the behavior as cover maintenance. First a bottle of wine, then a packaged dessert, then a folding table because Calvin never possessed enough surface area despite holding gatherings constantly. All defensible. The temperature probe was harder to justify. Calvin had complained for 3 weeks about his old wireless thermometer dropping connection whenever he walked inside. Theryn researched replacements. He compared sensor accuracy, radio range, battery endurance, environmental sealing, and probe response time. He purchased the best civilian unit available within a reasonable price range. At the next barbecue, he handed Calvin the box. The human stared. Calvin asked what was in the box. Theryn told him his temperature probe was unreliable. Calvin agreed that he knew. This one is not, Theryn said. Calvin opened it. His face changed. Calvin's expression changed when he saw the model. He told Keith the unit was expensive. Theryn called the cost acceptable, which only made Calvin point out that he had not needed to buy it. Theryn answered yes before realizing that was the wrong response. Calvin looked at him. Theryn realized the error. No, I know. Hector appeared over Calvin's shoulder. What'd he get? Calvin showed him. Hector whistled. Well, now he's going to be unbearable. More unbearable, Noreen corrected from the patio. Calvin shook his head. Seriously, thanks. Theryn felt an uncomfortable warmth beneath the human disguise. He attributed it to ambient temperature. That evening, his handler flagged the purchase. Explain expenditure, precision food temperature instrumentation. Theryn wrote. Equipment supported continued social access to target neighborhood network. The response arrived immediately. The mission does not reimburse gifts to neighbors. Theryn stared, then transferred the cost from his personal account. His handler sent another message. That was not the part I found concerning. Theryn ignored it. At barbecue 12, Calvin handed him the new thermometer and said, "You're on brisket." Theryn accepted the responsibility without argument. Hector looked horrified. "You're letting the data analyst touch the brisket." "He bought the thermometer. That doesn't make him qualified." Theryn checked the smoker temperature. The left side is running 11 degrees warmer than the right. Hector stared. Calvin frowned. "Seal leak." Theryn had already noticed a thin line of smoke escaping near the hinge. "Yes." Calvin shrugged. "I know, been meaning to fix it." Theryn looked at him. Theryn pointed out that Calvin possessed the tools to fix the leak and that replacement gasket material cost less than the meat he kept cooking in the defective chamber. Calvin agreed with both observations. When Theryn asked whether he had known about the problem all along, Calvin admitted that he had. Theryn walked into Calvin's garage. He returned with gasket material. 20 minutes later, the leak was gone. The smoker temperature evened. Hector watched the procedure. "This is getting too scientific." Theryn turned. "Temperature consistency directly affects rendering and moisture retention." Everyone went quiet. Theryn continued before realizing his mistake. If the chamber has a persistent differential, then Calvin must compensate through placement or rotation. Correcting the seal reduces unnecessary intervention and stabilizes airflow. Hector's eyebrows rose. Calvin slowly smiled. Noreen folded her arms. Theryn stopped. "What?" Hector pointed at him. "He got you." "Who?" "Calvin." Theryn did not understand. Calvin handed him a beer. "Welcome to the problem." Theryn accepted it. He never included that exchange in his report. Chapter 9. The storm. The storm arrived in late summer. Human Meteorological Services predicted it accurately. The severity was not extraordinary for the region, but saturated ground and strong winds brought trees down across power lines. Theryn's neighborhood lost electricity shortly after 3 in the afternoon. He knew because every artificial sound in his house stopped at once. The air conditioning, refrigeration, and background electronics all stopped, leaving the house in sudden silence. His mission equipment switched automatically to concealed internal power. Human systems did not. Theryn opened the utility status network. Several substations were offline. Estimated restoration ranged from 12 hours to 2 days depending on the circuit. He began recording. Human infrastructure resilience was a legitimate intelligence subject. 20 minutes later, someone knocked. Calvin stood outside wearing a rain jacket. "Your power's out." "Yes." "Ours too, come over." Theryn looked past him. "Why?" Calvin seemed surprised. "Because." That answer had become disturbingly common. At the Prout house, the smoker was already operating. So was the grill. People began arriving carrying food from refrigerators and freezers. Rosa came directly from her shift, still wearing paramedic trousers. Hector arrived with a portable generator and immediately complained that Calvin's extension cords were too light for the load. Calvin told him where heavier ones were stored. Neither paused the argument. Noreen began sorting food by what needed cooking first. Micah Trent, the teenager who usually controlled the music, collected younger children into the den where a battery-powered fan and lanterns had been set up. An elderly couple from the corner house arrived because their medical refrigeration needed power. Rosa checked the medication temperature. Hector moved his generator to support it. Another neighbor brought a second generator. Theryn watched. No one appeared to be coordinating. He found Calvin carrying thawing meat toward the smoker. "Who is in charge?" Calvin looked around. "Of what?" "This." Calvin shifted the tray. "Nobody." "That is impossible." "Okay." He walked away. Theryn stood in the yard. Tasks were happening anyway. A neighbor with a chainsaw cleared a fallen branch from the road while someone else checked the 3 houses whose occupants had not appeared. Noreen maintained a written list of refrigerated food so nothing sat warm too long. Rosa moved between households checking elderly residents. Micah organized phone charging around a battery bank and prohibited younger children from using it for games. Hector inspected electrical loads. Calvin cooked. The same yard Theryn had spent months categorizing as inefficient recreation became an operations center without changing shape. Theryn's professional training finally gave him a useful way to see what was happening. The yard was not a command center in the military sense. It was a network whose links had been maintained for months through trivial exchanges. People had carried chairs, borrowed tools, watched children, repaired gates, brought excess food, complained about smokers, and learned who could do what. The storm did not create cooperation. It merely raised the cost of the problems those relationships were suddenly solving. He could now identify capabilities that no formal emergency registry would have placed together. Hector understood residential electrical loads because he had spent decades repairing industrial equipment before retirement. Rosa knew which older residents had medication requirements because she had treated half of them at some point. Calvin knew where extension cords, hand tools, fuel cans, and spare tarps were stored across 3 houses because he had borrowed or lent most of them. Noreen knew who had not appeared because she knew who normally would. Theryn had originally mapped the neighborhood looking for influence. The people others obeyed, the households where information concentrated, the individuals with access to valuable institutions. The storm showed him a different kind of strength. No one needed to obey Calvin for Calvin to cook. No one needed formal authority over Hector for Hector to keep the medical refrigerator powered. Nobody issued Rosa an order to check on elderly residents. Familiarity allowed people to recognize useful work and begin doing it before a command structure would even have finished deciding who was responsible. Then Hector yelled at him, "Keith, you're the numbers guy. Come here." Theryn approached. 2 generators sat beneath temporary rain covers. Extension cables ran toward 3 houses. Hector pointed at the load labels. "I've got the Frank's medical fridge, Calvin's kitchen fridge, and 2 fans. Denise wants to add a freezer. Tell me if I've got room." Theryn calculated, "Not safely on this circuit." "Thought so." "You can shift the kitchen refrigerator to the 2nd generator, but its startup surge overlaps the medical unit." Hector frowned. "Can you split it?" "Yes." Theryn knelt beside the generators and helped redistribute the loads. One cable proved inadequate, so he replaced it. The generators stabilized, and Hector gave a satisfied nod. "Knew keeping you around would pay off." Theryn almost corrected him. Instead, he went looking for more extension cords. For the next 6 hours, no one assigned Theryn a formal position. He acquired a role anyway. Over the next several hours, he mapped electrical capacity, tracked fuel consumption, built a charging schedule, and helped keep refrigerated medication stable. Reconfigured a damaged transfer switch at Martin Creel's house after verifying it could be isolated safely. At some point, Noreen placed a plate beside him. He ate without stopping work. At sunset, 31 people were gathered across 3 connected yards. Not all of the 31 people were friends, and several did not particularly like one another. Some were still arguing. Even so, everyone had eaten. The medical refrigerators remained cold. Every child was accounted for, 2 fallen trees had been cleared, and 5 households had temporary power. An elderly man who lived alone had been found sitting in a dark house because he had not wanted to bother anyone. He was now asleep in Calvin's recliner. Theryn stood beneath the patio awning while rain moved across the street. His concealed recorder had captured everything. The data was extraordinary. He opened a field report. He began professionally. Local power loss produced rapid voluntary redistribution of food, portable generation capacity, technical labor, transportation, childcare, and medical support. He continued. No formal authority structure emerged. Coordination depended primarily on pre-existing interpersonal familiarity and repeated low-cost reciprocity. He stopped. Across the yard, Hector handed Calvin a dry towel without being asked. Rosa was telling Noreen which elderly neighbors she had checked. Micah had fallen asleep beside 3 younger children. Martin Creel arrived carrying fuel cans and gave one to Calvin before they resumed a disagreement about where the neighborhood drainage ditch actually crossed the property line. Theryn looked at the report and added one final sentence. The neighbors helped each other. He stared at the words because they were not intelligence language. He deleted the sentence, considered the cleaner terminology, and then put the plain version back. Chapter 10. A year. The mission ended 11 months and 28 days after insertion. Theryn's handler contacted him shortly after breakfast. "Observer Korrad, Central Analysis has accepted your final cultural packet." Theryn looked toward the calendar. Saturday was 2 days away. Theryn acknowledged the handler, who informed him that Central Analysis had accepted his final cultural packet and rated his performance above projected intelligence yield. His cover remained secure, and his human institutional mapping was considered especially valuable. Theryn called that good. Then the handler said, Extraction is scheduled Friday at 2200 local time. Theryn stared at the wall. Friday. Calvin was making pork shoulder Saturday. Theryn had already agreed to bring coleslaw because Noreen had informed him his first attempt was surprisingly competent, which he had later confirmed was praise. The handler continued. Transfer site is the usual commercial corridor. Your residence will remain under cover ownership for 90 days before disposal. Theryn said nothing. Observer. Yes. Is there an operational issue? Theryn looked toward his refrigerator. A container of homemade sauce sat on the upper shelf. Hector had given it to him while insisting he was forbidden to tell Calvin the recipe. Yes. The handler's voice sharpened. Explain. Theryn opened his mouth. There was no explanation acceptable under Velathi intelligence doctrine. Theryn said there was no immediate threat. The handler reminded him that this had not been the question. Unable to offer an acceptable explanation, Theryn said he required time to review continuity implications. The handler granted him 48 hours. The connection ended. Theryn sat alone. He had spent nearly a year maintaining perfect separation between Theryn Korrad and Keith Fenwick. Theryn was the intelligence observer. Keith was supposed to be the cover, but Keith attended barbecues. Keith knew Rosa worked too many night shifts, that Hector's shoulder hurt when it rained even though he denied it, that Micah wanted to study sound engineering and worried his father considered it impractical, and that Calvin pretended not to care when his oldest daughter missed a gathering while checking his phone every 15 minutes. None of that was intelligence relevant. The problem felt unfamiliar because his previous departures had been clean. At the end of the Freight Consortium assignment, he had deleted the cover account, returned 3 borrowed objects through anonymous delivery, and left the planet before anyone realized the auditor had resigned. He remembered feeling satisfaction at the elegance of it. No loose ends, no explanations, no one who would wonder why he stopped answering messages. Keith Fenwick could not disappear that way. Noreen had his spare house key because he had locked himself out once. Calvin had promised to help replace a section of fence before winter. Rosa occasionally sent him questions about aerospace news because she believed he understood the industry. Micah had asked him to review a college application essay the following month. Hector had entrusted him with a sauce recipe under conditions of absurd secrecy. These were not intelligence assets. That classification no longer made the facts easier. For the first time in his career, Theryn understood that terminating a cover could damage people who had never consented to be part of an intelligence operation. They would not be endangered, they would simply lose Keith. The distinction was professionally important and personally useless. That was the problem. Saturday afternoon, Theryn attended what was supposed to be his final barbecue. He arrived at noon, which was early by his original standards and late by his current ones. Calvin was beside the smoker. You look weird. Theryn looked down at himself. His projection was stable. I look normal. That's not what I meant. Noreen came outside carrying a bowl. He means you're doing the face. What face? The one where you're thinking too hard. Theryn disliked how accurately these humans had learned him. He placed the coleslaw on the table. My employer may transfer me. Calvin stopped adjusting the smoker vent. Far. Potentially. Noreen's expression changed. When? Soon. Hector came through the gate carrying his potato salad. What I miss? Keith might be moving, Calvin said. Hector frowned. Well, who's going to keep him from ruining brisket? Calvin pointed at himself. Hector shook his head. Exactly. Theryn almost smiled. People reacted throughout the afternoon. Rosa made him promise to send an address. Micah asked whether he was leaving the group chat. Noreen told him he could store anything he needed in their garage during the move. Hector complained that Theryn had finally learned something about barbecue and was now wasting the education. Nobody demanded details. Nobody asked what they would receive in return. Near sunset, Calvin stood beside him at the fence. Work thing. Yes. You want to go? Theryn considered lying. No. Calvin nodded. Then maybe don't. It may not be entirely my decision. Yeah. They watched the yard. Children moved through the grass. Hector was arguing with Rosa about music volume. Noreen was packing food for a neighbor working late. Calvin took a drink. Well, wherever you land, you've got people here. Theryn looked at him. Calvin seemed unaware that he had said anything significant. Food's about ready. He walked toward the smoker. Theryn remained beside the fence. His species trained intelligence officers to resist coercion, isolation, interrogation, and manipulation. He had never been trained for a middle-aged electrician saying he had people. That omission now seemed serious. Chapter 11. Compromised. Theryn contacted his handler at 2113. I am requesting extension of assignment. Silence, then on what grounds? Theryn grounded the extension request in continuity. When the handler demanded an explanation, he argued that replacing him would sacrifice developed trust and long-term observation value. The handler countered that his assigned collection targets had already been mapped. Theryn said networks changed. The handler replied that they always did. So Theryn became more specific. His integration now provided low-friction access to civilian resilience behavior, municipal infrastructure personnel, emergency medicine, technical labor, and neighborhood-level information exchange. His handler was silent. Theryn continued. All of those categories increased in relevance during the storm event. That is true. Extraction destroys the access without operational necessity. Another pause. Central may approve a long-term observation extension. Good. I did not say they would. Theryn waited. The handler's voice became quieter. Has your cover been compromised? Theryn looked toward his dark living room. He thought about the question. Yes. The handler's breathing changed. The handler immediately asked who had compromised him. Theryn said it was not in the way the handler meant, then clarified that no human knew his species, mission, or actual identity. The handler pointed out that, by definition, this meant his cover was not compromised. Theryn looked at the photograph on his refrigerator. It had been taken during the storm. The photograph showed Calvin holding a spatula with Noreen beside him, Hector arguing in the background, Rosa making an obscene gesture toward the camera, and Micah laughing. Theryn stood near one edge holding a coil of extension cable, unaware that anyone was taking the picture. Keith Fenwick has developed relationships that complicate clean termination. His handler went silent for several seconds. Then the handler said, "You are describing attachment." Theryn insisted he was describing operational continuity. The handler answered by reminding him that he had reimbursed the mission for a meat thermometer. Theryn defended the purchase as personal, only to realize that this was precisely why the handler had mentioned it. Theryn's jaw tightened. The handler continued. The handler asked how many barbecues he had attended. 18, Theryn answered immediately. The handler noted the speed of the response. Theryn claimed the number was documented. The handler dryly pointed out that he had not checked. Theryn said nothing. The handler sighed. At last, the handler agreed to forward the extension request. Theryn thanked him and promised to provide the formal rationale Central would require. Before closing the channel, the handler added one final warning. Theryn was not required to convince anyone that the pork shoulder was strategically significant. Theryn stared at the wall. I never said it was. You were about to. The channel closed. Chapter 12. 19. Central approved a 6-month extension. Theryn read the authorization twice and then a third time, telling himself that intelligence orders required precision. Saturday morning, he walked next door carrying coffee. Calvin was setting up the smoker. He looked toward Theryn. Thought you'd be packing. Plans changed. Calvin nodded without interrogating him or celebrating the change. He simply opened the smoker and handed Theryn the temperature probe. Good. Watch this. Theryn accepted it. Theryn asked for the target temperature. Calvin told him not to start. Theryn insisted that he required parameters, and Calvin handed him the probe with the irritating observation that Theryn already knew them. Theryn did. That was another problem. By noon, Hector had arrived and immediately criticized the seasoning. Rosa appeared after a shift and fell asleep in a lawn chair 30 minutes later, while Micah took over the music and Noreen began carrying out trays. The gathering expanded in the usual human fashion. Someone Theryn did not recognize arrived with Calvin's cousin and was given a drink without investigation. 2 children from farther down the street appeared because they had heard other children outside, while one neighbor brought peaches and another brought bread. Theryn's recorder remained active in his pocket. He had activated it automatically that morning as the yard began filling around him. Calvin asked for help moving a table, and Theryn helped without thinking about whether the task counted as observation. Hector then wanted an opinion about whether the smoker's exhaust looked wrong. Theryn checked it and found nothing unusual. Noreen asked him to carry a covered plate to the elderly man who had slept in Calvin's recliner during the storm. Theryn went, and when he returned, someone had placed a drink beside his chair. He did not know who. He sat down and accepted it. For several minutes, Theryn simply listened to the music and conversation, to a child laughing nearby, and to Calvin opening the smoker despite repeatedly warning everyone that opening it released heat. Hector immediately pointed out the contradiction, and Noreen told both men to stop arguing. Theryn reached into his pocket and turned off the recorder. No one noticed. The gathering continued, and for the next several minutes nothing happened that could possibly be described as operationally significant. It was one of the best afternoons of his mission. Epilogue. Additional fieldwork. Near sunset, his handler contacted him with a follow-up question from Central Analysis. Theryn told him to proceed. The handler noted that the original cultural packet contained 18 barbecue observations. 19 now, Theryn corrected automatically. His handler paused. Of course. While the handler continued, Theryn watched Calvin remove the pork shoulder from the smoker. Hector immediately leaned over to inspect it, and Noreen slapped his hand away. His handler continued. Analysis wants a definitive description of the social function of these gatherings. Theryn looked across the yard. Rosa was asleep beneath a borrowed blanket. Micah had surrendered music control to one of the younger children and clearly regretted it. Martin Creel was eating beside Calvin despite having argued with him about drainage that morning. Noreen was packing a plate for someone who had not been able to attend, while Hector tasted the pork and tried very hard not to look impressed. Calvin noticed anyway. "Keith," Calvin shouted, "quit working and come eat." Theryn looked down at the communicator. His handler said, "Observer." He considered the year of reports. The food preparation and hospitality, the arguments and repairs, the children and storms, the neighbors and favors and leftovers, the people who liked each other and the people who did not, and the 6 unnecessary hours humans would cheerfully spend producing dinner together. A year earlier, Theryn would have described the gathering as inefficient food preparation surrounded by unstructured social activity. Now he knew that description was technically accurate in the same way a parts list was technically a description of a machine. It named the visible pieces and missed what happened when they worked together. Barbecue did not manufacture courage, generosity, or emergency competence. It gave those qualities somewhere inexpensive to practice. People learned one another in circumstances where the stakes were low. They argued, borrowed, repaired, fed, watched children, carried things, and showed up again. When the stakes rose during the storm, nobody had to invent trust from nothing. I have not reached a definitive conclusion. The handler sounded tired. After 19 observations. Theryn picked up the plate Noreen had already set aside for him. I believe I require additional fieldwork. From beside the smoker, Hector shouted, if he says that's good barbecue, he's finally qualified to stay. Calvin replied that nobody had asked Hector. Their argument began immediately. Theryn closed the channel. Understood, he said, and went to eat.